Hello again. What we want to talk about today, generally speaking, is HTML and the representation of HTML in the browser, as well as how events work if we have time for that. So that's probably going to be partially covered. However, we're going to start with a different example. It's something we've skipped when talking about the objects, and we want to look over some extensions to the class structure, the class syntax. This is not actually part of the standard, it's proposed, but it's something that appeared in one of the tutorial exercises and I'd like to go through it. So we're going to write it in HTML because this is the way we're doing things today. So let's assume we have some class. Let's call it A. Now the first thing we want to talk about is that we can have private fields. Right? So private fields are not visible from the exterior. So if I have something like this, and this is how to define a private field, I can't actually give one an instance of this class, right? An object of this type. Uh, there's not going to be any a.prop1. Now, the way to access this, if I do want to access it, if it's not something which is strictly internal to the class, is through some accessors, right? So this is a special property structure which we didn't get to discuss. So let's assume we want to access this through some special methods. Now the reason why we might want to do this is that for the getter side, our internal representation might differ from what we want to show to the outside world, and for the setter side, we might want to impose some to either transform the input or to impose some restrictions on the input, such as, for example, if I have a one of these properties which gives me the age, I might want to not update the value unless the age is valid, so something between 0 and a maximum age, because the negative age would not be valid. Now, given our property, what we're going to do is we're going so our property, our secret property is dsprop1, so sharp prop1. So we're going to say get prop1, which is something different, and set prop1. One sec. Now these look like they'd look in any other language which has property support. That is, the getter returns my value and has no parameters, while the setter returns nothing and should have a value to update the one, the hidden one. Now that being said, we talked about validations and such. We're not going to do this, but we could. So what we're going to do in the getter is return this dot sharp prop, or whilst what we're going to do in the setter is we're going to say yes sharp prop is v. So that's how we control access to something. Um, there was actually a way of doing this. Let's call it functional encapsulation, which is done in a completely different way. But as per usual, we could have done this in JavaScript. We just didn't have the nice syntax. Now let's first test out that this is working as intended. A.prop1, right? Because this is the visible variant. Now this is actually not working as intended. That's because we forgot to add our constructor. So let's add our constructor to give it an initial value. And let's call it constructor of some value. And we're gonna say this dot sharp prop1 is value. All right, so we can just see something here instead of undefined. And to use the setter, we're gonna say a.prop1 equals 2, and then rewrite it to the console. Right, so testing this out, let's just look at it. S is going to be visible in the browser console, and we can see 1 and 2 respectively. Now another thing which we might have, which is again this new syntax, is that we might have static fields, right? So static fields are something which okay, I'll explain again. So this is a strangest syntax which doesn't exist in the standard, but it's a proposal which is most likely going to be accepted. And the reason why we're looking into it is that we've chosen to show it in a tutorial example. So this, right, this is the equivalent of defining this dot prop one. Okay. So if I didn't have if it wasn't a private property, what I would have had is this dot prop one equals whatever's. And the idea of having these private properties is to avoid something like this. So if I ignore the private property, I would have had something like this dot uh, prop1 equals 1 in the constructor, right? The problem is I could have still written to this. I could have used it in the setters and everywhere, and I would have had the same behavior. However, I could have still accessed it from the exterior, right? I would have just marked it as something which is not intended to be accessed from outside, but it would have been accessible. So with this syntax, which is new, I can just say this prop1 is not directly visible from the exterior, so that's why we get to the getter and the setter. Does this make sense? It's the same as a private property in, say, Java. Please confirm in chat if this is clear enough. Okay. Now, as for static fields, right? So we're also going to make our it needn't be private. However, we're going to make it private, and we're going to do a static field, which is going to be the count of the total number of created objects, right? So this type A is going to remember how many instances were created. Now, when talking about concepts like how many instances were created, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to have something which is characteristic not of a particular object, but of the type itself. Now, even without the class structure, we could have done this in JavaScript because what's common between the objects of the same type is a concrete object, so it can have state and so forth. So we could have done this in the functional way as well, but this is just more familiar, so to speak. So if we want to have such a count, let's say it's another private property, so it's going to be static count, and it's going to start from 0. Uh, Now, something to note: static fields, we have static methods, which are methods which refer to the class, and we have static initializers. Now, a static initializer is just going to be a block of code marked with static, which can, for example, can be used to initialize static variables and so forth. In this case, it's simple enough, so it's not, we're just putting a number in a variable, so it's not complicated enough to need this. So we have this private count, and first of all we should use it. So to use it, we have to increment sharp count. Now we can't actually access sharp count from any instance, right? So what we're going to have to do is access it from A. Right. Now, the second problem is that since it's private, it's not going to be visible from the outside. So what we might want to do is give somebody a way, somebody using our class a way to actually read the count. So we might do something like this: get count. But since the count itself is static, it would make more sense to do this, right? So static get count, return a dot sharp count. Now, can we survive without these features? Of course we can. But I thought it would be better for you to be familiar with them. Now let's create another object and see what the count is going to be, right? So let's have an a2 of 2, and if we do console log a dot count, which works because we have this getter, we're going to see in the browser something which is most unclear. So let's just one sec. Let's just write some string in front of it. So say total created a object. Right. Right. So we have 2 of them. So that's what I wanted to explain. Uh, Now, if there are any more questions regarding this example, please raise your hand or write in chat or something. Radio. So now let's talk about HTML and the associated things. Now, although we've opted to talk about JavaScript first, the primary or the first fundamental web technology is HTML, right? This is what the web was built for. And uh, one sec, I'm going to pause. Right, so I was saying that HTML is let's say, the fundamental technology of the web. But it's evolved in time, both in content. Well, it's not evolved in content that much, but it's evolved in its usage. Because if you think about HTML, this is the first website, and if you look at the first website, right, it's relatively simple. It's somewhat easier to understand that it is HTML. However, this is also HTML, right? The structure of this is also HTML, right? So HTML has to cover both this, and this was published some 30 odd years ago, and something complex. This is a lot closer to an application than to whatever this is. Now, when HTML was introduced, um, the thinking was that HTML is something to define documents with, right? It's a document definition language. Now, this might make us wonder what's so radical about HTML. Well, if you think about large amounts of text, traditionally or historically, uh, for a long time in humanity's history, the way to access large amount of text was through some sort of index, right? So I have a list of relevant words at the end of a book, and they tell me what page I can find them on. Now, if I scale this and I say, well, in a library, I'd have again some sort of an index which is going to tell me where to find a particular book. Now, the idea behind the web is relatively new, and it's this idea of hypertext, which means that in a large amount of text, such as all the text available online, I can link from any part of the text to any other part of the text, which means I have a web of references instead of having an index. Now, like I said initially, this was thought of in the context of writing documents. And I still have the remnants of this, right? Because this is definitely something which was thought of as a document, this first web page. But in time, for the fact that the web applications became more and more complex, HTML became not something to write documents with, but something to define structure with, right? Because if you think about writing complex graphical user interfaces of any sort, we're going to have some fundamental primary concerns, right? So we have to define the structure of our interface. We have to define how it looks, the presentation of our interface, and the behavior. And the structure is what we're using HTML for. Now, why would I want to have different languages? Well, another issue which I run across when I talk about complex applications is I want to separate concerns as much as possible, right? So if something is preoccupied with a particular facet of my code, I'd like it for as much as possible to have it separate, so I can modify it without affecting other aspects of my code. Right? So I can modify presentation without affecting the structure, or I can modify behavior without affecting the structure. Now that being said, there's another characteristic to HTML and to the web in general, which is reflected in JavaScript as well, which is there's a lot of content already out there, and that content has to still be accessible and working in the case of JavaScript and accessible in the case of HTML. Which means I'm going to have a really strong motivation to keep things backward compatible, so to speak. Because since this is the first web page, we're still able to read it, right? It still works exactly as as initially constructed, which means I have some characteristics of various HTML elements uh, which aren't just structural, right? They're not purely structural. That's because I have to still be able to see this page. Right. So that's the general gist of HTML. Let's look over some examples and explain them one by one and use them as a way to explore the language. So first of all, if I think about the simplest HTML file, let's just do this. Let's just write an HTML, some text. And if I open this, I'm going to see that a couple of things happen. So first off, this is really simple. I'm going to use my inspection tools. And I'm going to see that actually if I go to elements, I'm going to have a bunch more stuff. So I just wrote HTML slash HTML and some text. But I have a bunch more stuff. And this actually shows me the fundamental structure of an HTML file. But it shows me something else, which is that the browser, as a default stance, tries to be tolerant of whatever I do. Right? HTML is and the web itself was imagined to be as democratic as possible, right? So if you write something stupid but which can be compensated for, the browser is going to compensate for it. In this case, it added a bunch of tags, right? So it said body and head. But before we go to body and head, let's think about the principles behind HTML. So HTML is a markup language. It's in the title, right? So if I do something like the fox jumps, so I have some text, and what I want to do at this point is I want to highlight the text, for lack of a better word, in order to specify what each thing is, right? So what I want to do is I want to tag parts of the text. Now, if I might want to tag the subject and the predicate of this particular proposition, I might use some tags which, I don't know, look like this. So that's the subject and this is the predicate. And the whole thing itself is a proposition, a phrase. Now, what I might notice is that I'm going to, if the semantic, let's say, vocabulary gets larger and larger, I'm going to run out of tags. So I need to have a way of having abstract tags, right? It's something to extend the tag set. So what I might do is I might say, okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to have a tag name between some sort of marker. In this case, I have less than and greater than. And I'm going to say subject, let's say S from subject. And this is going to be the same parentheses I had. And here I'm going to have predicate, something like this. And the whole thing is going to be a phrase and so forth. Now I might notice something else, which is, let's say we're not doing this kind of tagging, but rather we're doing just like underlining a book. We want to mark them with a particular color. So we might say something like red, and here we might say green, etc. Now I notice that these tags are actually, let's call them instances of a more abstract tag, which is color, right? So instead of writing all the colors as separate tags, we might want our tags to be configurable somehow. So what we might want to do is write color here. So this is underlined with a color, and this is underlined with a color, etc. And have some sort of attribute, right? So this was red, so we're gonna say color value red and color value green. Right, so this is an interesting way to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to customize my tag via a list of key value pairs, where the key is value here and the value is red. So this is going to give me tags which are adaptable to different contexts. And this is exactly what happens in HTML. So I have tags, although I don't have necessarily the same tags I've written here. And I have attributes on those tags to customize their behavior. Right, so let's get back to our HTML, and we're going to see these things one by one. So this is the simplest HTML file, but like we saw, the browser has to compensate for us somewhat. So it's not actually, it's, the expression, make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. Well, we've made them simpler than as simple as possible, so the browser had to do something for us. So I might write something like this. I actually have a code generator which is included included in Visual Studio Code. We're not going to care about these things, so this is going to be our minimal HTML document. And I'm going to write here some text. Radio. I'm actually going to write something else. I'm going to say it's in Romanian, and I'm going to write niște text. I'm actually going to copy paste niște text because I don't have the keyboard to write the sh. Right, so let's investigate this for a bit. So first of all, I can see that HTML has an attribute on it, and it says lang row. Now this is what it's called. It's called a global attribute, in the sense that all tags are going to, well, be able to use it. They're not necessarily all going to use it, but they can use it. Now it might not immediately seem useful, but it's enough to think about a page which uses multiple languages, right? So, for example, if I have the lyrics to a song and their translation in some language, I'm going to have multiple languages on the same page. Now, so lang is a global attribute. So tags have some global attributes, which we're going to look over shortly, but they also have some specific attributes. Now, apart within my HTML, I can see that I have two large areas, right? A head area, a head tag, and the body tag. Now, what body is going to contain is what I'm supposed to display, right? So the actual content of my page. What head is going to contain is meta information, right? Which is information I need in order to display the content, but which is not displayable itself. Now, this sort of applies to document, to title, right? Which is document. Because this is actually displayed, but it's not displayed in the page itself, but rather as a title in the tag. Now, what else? Well, in head, I might have other meta information. So I might have my needed scripts or my needed styles. I could include them in head, but also I can see I have a meta tag. Now, what is this? Well, this is meta charset UTF-8. Tells me how the characters in this page are represented. And this is an interesting idea, because initially, for most of these technologies, they were considered to be using the ASCII character set. But the ASCII character set doesn't support anything but the English language characters. Well, mostly. Well, and if you think about writing a page with Chinese characters, they wouldn't even fit in the ASCII set, right? Because there's thousands of them. Well then, at some point, a standard was drafted, which is called Unicode, which tells me what the numeric representation of a character is. And the way it's organized in pages and offsets. Right, so I have a bunch of pages which correspond to a particular language, and within each page I have a bunch of characters. It's a bit more complex than that, but this is not necessarily the time to explore it fully. Now, that's Unicode. So what's UTF-8? Well, this is a really interesting engineering solution, because so the number corresponding to a character is I get from Unicode. But then I have to to figure out how to represent that number. And I have a bunch of representations. So for example, UTF-32 means the character is going to be ultimately represented on 32 bits. Now UTF-16, 16 bits. UTF-8 actually doesn't mean the same thing, because if the character would be represented on 8 bits, it wouldn't fit, right? It's just the ASCII, the let's say the space I would use to represent an ASCII character. So what UTF-8 actually means is it's a variable length representation. Now why would that be useful? Now let's imagine I want to show this shoot character, right? Now if I want to show it, I have to understand what kind of character it is. And if I look in the page, of course, I have it written here. Unfortunately, this assumes I'm going to read the page correctly in order to display the page correctly, which doesn't quite work, does it? Right? Because if I have to read the page to know how to read the page, this gets cyclical. Right, so the way this happens is that UTF-8 actually has the characteristic that for the ASCII characters, it has the same representation as if they were pure ASCII characters, which means the browser is going to assume that this page only uses ASCII characters. It's going to thus correctly read this tag, which is going to allow it to reprocess the page with that specified encoding, right? So then it's going to understand the sh letter and be able to display it. And we can see that it is correctly displayed, right? So that's the idea behind the UTF-8 encoding. Okay, now to continue, I said that actually we talk about HTML from the perspective that it is. So the ideal perspective is that it's a structure definition language. However, HTML has some legacy bits which it has to maintain for the first website, for example, to still be able to display correctly. Let's investigate this through a simple example. So let's consider this HTML file. So we're gonna doc, and we're gonna have a div here. Now I'm gonna just say some div. What a div is, this is interesting. So if you think about displaying, so you have a bunch of text and you have an object within the text, which might also be text. If you think about how you could display this object, there are two great ways you can think about it. It's something you can see in Word, for example, if you insert an image. So that object might behave like a paragraph. That is, it breaks the text up and it doesn't allow anything to its left or its right. So it takes up the whole width. Or it might behave as a character. That is, it's inserted within the text and the text wraps around it. Now these two concepts are called block, right, as a paragraph, and inline as a character. And what div is, it's a tag which represents the idea of something which is a block. Its inline correspondent is a span, right? So this is what it's called an anonymous block division, which means it doesn't have any other information, right? Its semantic value is that it's a block division. And let's compare this to some headings, which are titles of various importance. So we're gonna say anyway, 1, 2, 3. There's headings from 1 to 6, but we're not really interested in that. It's you can read about this on your own. Right. So if we go to 4.html and we look at the elements, obviously we have the structure, which again we notice is a tree-like structure, but we can go here to styles and select the various things. So div, I can see there's a style here, initial style, which says user agent style sheet. Now what this is the style the div begins with, right, which is in the browser itself, and it has the minimal amount of style, right? I said that it's something which is displayed as block, and the div only has display block. That's it. Now if I look at h1 though, I'm going to notice that it has a bunch more style. Oh, come on. That's because, like I said, I have this backward compatibility concern. I have to have things backwards compatible. Right. Now let's proceed. Now something else I have to wonder about in HTML is I can see I have all these tags. So what happens if I want to talk about tags within tags, right? So what happens if I want to describe a tag uh, in a, you know, within a tag? So this is the same problem I have when I have to show the separator for a string within a string, right? I have to escape something. In this case, my reserved characters, intuitively speaking, are going to be less than, greater than, and whatever escape marker I have. So in the case of strings, I had backslash. In this case, I'm going to have an ampersand. So let's go into that. So we're gonna say 5.html. We don't really care about all the other stuff, so we're gonna just write the minimal HTML, and we're gonna say we want to write a less than, which is not going to be interpreted but just displayed. So we can do this by writing ampersand lt less than. So can be written as, and now we want to write an ampersand, which is not going to be interpreted, and we can do that with ampersand amp. Conversely, the same is going to be true for gt, right? So I can use gt for greater than. Right, so let's test this out, and we look at this. Right, so this is so it worked. The first thing we notice is that it worked, but the second thing we noticed we notice is that some other strange thing happened, which is we've written this on two lines and they're now on the same line. Now this is because this has a good reason behind it, which is uh, in HTML, the browser does something which is called white space collapse, which is any subsequent on any sequence of spaces or tabs or new lines or whatever is going to be transformed to a single space. This is because by default we want the browser to worry about this, right? We want the browser to be the one that handles how many words get on a particular row or something like that. We're going to see this shortly, but let's look over. We're going to see this and discuss it in the next example. But first, let's look at something where we could force the browser to do what we want. And one way of doing it is to add a manual line break. We don't actually care that much about the manual line BR, a manual line break. But see, if you think about the structure of a page as a tree, you can think about, let's say, potential children of a particular node. So what would a manual new line uh, possibly contain? Well, the answer is nothing. There's nothing we can imagine that we can have inside the new line. So this tag is going to be empty, well, always. So what we might do is write this in a different fashion, which is this, which is the BR tag both opened and closed, right? Because I can have nothing inside it anyway. Now, this is going to solve our new line problem. However, let's notice a different problem. Right, so we have the new line, but we still don't have the number of spaces. Now, traditionally, this was done through a special character called non-breaking space, which I can insert here and it's not going to be collapsed. Now, obviously, if I look at it from a maintainability standpoint, I can see that this is a bad idea. So I might want to handle this not the way I handled it here, but rather via CSS. However, let's look at this problem a bit longer. So it's so this idea of putting things on the same row. Why does the browser do that? Well, the browser does that because it's responsible with aligning things or splitting things, right? Splitting rows of text, aligning them on the page and so forth. Now, if I want to be responsible with it, I should mark them as having different meaning, right? So, right. So let's have an HTML, and let's have a first line and a second line. Now, if the only if I want these to be on different lines because they're just lines, that's the only significance they have, I should let the browser handle it. I shouldn't wonder about that. I should never think about the lines of my text. Let's see this. Let's get a bunch of text. So we're gonna get some classic text so we can see why this should be the case. One sec. It's I have a technical thing. Right. So this is some classic text to just test out things, and we need a bunch of text to just copy paste it. Oh, come on. Right. Right. So let's have a bunch of this text. Now, the fact that this text is on different lines is irrelevant. I should just let the browser do it. Right. But let's say that first line and second line have a different significance. First, let's see how it looks and why we might not want to, we might want the browser to do it itself. Right. Radio. So in this situation, I can see that if the user zooms, the browser is going to handle how many characters are on a line. Or if the user is on a different device, right, it's still going to be all right. Um, Now, if they do have semantic, they're different semantically, I might want to mark them as something. So this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph. And so this is what I do in HTML. I semantically tag things which have different significance, actually. And now I've taken responsibility myself, and I know that these two are different semantically. Right. Now, there's something else we're just going to refer to it, which is, let's say I have some code and I want to maintain the formatting. I can use something which is called the pre-block, and this is going to say if something, for example, and this is just going to maintain the formatting, right? If I need something like that. Now, what can I use within HTML, right? What are my let's say my fundamental atoms? So the first thing we want to look at is length, right? Because, like I said, it's hypertext, it's text length by length. So we're just going to want to see how we use length. So in the simplest form, we can have so we have an A. Let's say we want to go to 2, 3. Now, obviously, this link isn't going to work, right? Because it has something inside it, which is what's going to be clickable, the clickable bit, but it doesn't say where it's supposed to go. So this is a tag which needs an attribute. In this case, it's going to be href, HTTP reference to some URL. Now, we could write this either within the value of the attribute, either within double quotes, single quotes, or we could use no quotes whatsoever. And we can do this as long as we don't don't cause confusion. Now, what would cause confusion mean? Well, in this case, if I think about multiple attributes within the same tag, it's probably going to require that we have a separator between them, and the separator is going to be space. So if my value contains a space, I can't use this syntax, but if it doesn't, I can. One sec.
Right, so I can use the simplified way of going to arguments. Let's see if this works. And additionally, let's put another attribute, which is going to be target blank. And this is actually going to tell my browser to open the link in a different tab. Now, target blank is a really interesting thing because I kept talking about this backward compatibility thing. And generally, once a feature appears in HTML, it doesn't disappear. Now, there's an exception to this, which is a whole bunch of tags which refer to something which is called a frame set, which is the concept of representing a web page out of partials. So out of other, an HTML is going to contain other HTMLs, which is the one feature which appeared and disappeared. And this is the target bit is actually part of that frame set specification, but it remained with us. So if I go to 7, I'm going to see that I'm going to be able to open 3. I'm going to open 3 if I say 3 here instead of 1. So that's something I missed. Right, so I'm going to open 3, which is niche text. Now, the second thing we might want to think about is how I'm going to navigate things, right? So what happens if I want to go to a file which is in some dir, and let's say 2, let's say 4, let's say 2, yeah, 2 is in some dir. How do I make a link to that? Well, obviously, I don't have a way of knowing the path, the absolute path, so where the file is on the server's hard drive. However, I do have a way of knowing the relative path, right? Which is where this file is in respects to myself. And in respects to the web root of the server, I can also do that. But in respects to myself in this case. So I can do href 2.html, and again we're going to target blank. Now this isn't going to work out because 2 is not there. But what I might say is /some_dir /2.html. And I can go to 2. Now what happens if in 2 I want to go to 4? Well, let's put a link here. And now I have to do something else, which is I have to navigate somewhere in my parent. And the way I'm going to do this is just like I would in the operating system itself, which is I'm going to use dot dot, right? Because dot is the current directory and dot dot is my parent directory, whichever that may be. So I can go to 4.html. Something else to note, let's just see this is working first. So we go to 2 and this takes us to 4. Something else to note is that, for example, like I said, URLs might contain, because this is a simplified URL, URLs might contain characters which aren't valid in an URL. Right? I might want to make a link to a file which has a name which isn't valid in an URL. For example, space. And we've discussed this in our first course. That for space, for example, I'm going to use %20. This is because I have an encoding scheme called percent encoding, right, which is going to allow me to specify characters which would otherwise not be valid. Radio. So with this introduction, let's see what we have available in HTML. Now, we have let's call it a minimal set of objects that we can represent. And that's because what I want to do to have for HTML is to have it as generally implemented as possible, right? To have it homogeneous over different browsers and the different servers, and everything should work the same. So this is the minimal level. So let's first look at a couple of objects which are objects for which I can display things, because I have two different things, right? So I have output components, output tags, and input tags. So for output tags, the first thing we're going to see is a list. And I can declare a list in one of two ways. So I can have an unordered list and I can have an ordered list, OL. Uh, Either one of them will contain a bunch of LIs, which is list item. Let's just say 2. The difference is going to be that for an unordered list, the list marker, so that is the thing which appears in front of the elements of a list. So for an unordered list is going to be a bullet, and for ordered list is going to be a number. And I can see them here. I do notice something strange, which is if I select the text, I'm not going to get the marker. Now this is because the marker is populated it's created in a strange way, which we're going to come back to when we talk about CSS. Now the second thing we might need is a table. Now I'm going to just copy paste the table from a file, but we're going to talk about it. Okay, let me just find it. Right, so a table is going to be declared with the table tag. And this is going to contain, in this case, is going to contain a t head, a header, and a t body. And each of these contains rows. Now I noticed that, at least in my file, t head contains no rows whatsoever. However, we come back to the browser behavior, which says that the browser is going to try to make our structure valid, which means if we look in inspect, we're going to see that t head does contain a row, and that row is going to contain some th cells, which is table header, while these in the body are going to contain some td cells, which is table data. And I can see my table, and I said that th actually contains the tr, and I can see that this is indeed true. The browser created it for me. I can also see that the styles are relatively complex, the default styles. Now something else that you might see here, well, we have what you might call multimedia content. So in the sense that we can, from the very beginning, we could use images in HTML, and we can use them like this. So it's image source, etc. And this is, where were we? This is actually the first personal computer. It's called Altair. Um, Now this has actually, let's call it advanced or diversified, in the sense that starting with HTML5, we can also use on one hand audio content, video content, which works similarly to this, and we have a special tag called canvas. Now canvas is really exceptional in the sense that you can see pretty clearly that I don't actually worry myself about how things are drawn. I'm going to, even with CSS, I'm more going to guide the browser. Well, Canvas is a context within a web page in which I can have direct drawing, right? So direct drawing is going to mean drawing stuff at the pixel level, which is something which allows me to do, let's say, video games. Right? I can draw them pixel by. I have to draw them pixel by pixel. I might imagine something which is, let's say, through HTML and JavaScript, but actually for a relatively complex video game, I'm going to need this sort of control. Right. So this is tables. Now, before we progress, because I said I have some output things, which are lists, tables, images, etc., and some input things, which are forms. But before we get to forms, let's talk about something else, which is the fact that before anything else, I have to be able to draw the structure of a web page. Now, what do I mean by that?
Well, let's. I've actually drawn something like this at the previous course. So let's imagine that we're talking about our web page and we're showing it to somebody and we say, okay, so it's going to have this classic generic structure in which you have some a header with some header stuff in it, such as the logo or a search box or doesn't matter. We have a navigation sidebar, and whenever I select something from the navigation sidebar, this part, the main content is populated. So how would I describe that? Because I keep saying that we're using HTML for structure. So how would such a structure be represented? Where historically, you know, in the beginning, they were represented as tables. Now this approach actually brings about a lot of style because we saw that tables have a lot of legacy style information. So this approach advanced to something which is divs with semantic classes. Now let's see this. So let's look at the picture again. It's this what that we're trying to represent. So let's create a 10.html, and I'm going to just copy paste it because it would take a long while to write it by hand. So I notice that I have the body, which contains a div, which has a class called page. So what I'm doing here is I'm using divs, which have no semantic content whatsoever, but I'm adding some classes to tell me what the divs are supposed to be. So in this case, this is the page, this bit is the header, this bit is the main part, which is this part, this whole part, the sidebar and the main content. And then I have a sidebar and the view, which is the content. Now this is better because it doesn't have any style information, so I'm free to add my own. I can see that it doesn't look in any particular way. However, it does have the intended structure. Okay, but the problem here might be that I'm supposed to use classes typically for presentation things. And here what I'm doing is I'm using classes to just define the significance of a div. So in HTML5 we got a bunch of new tags which are basically semantic divs, right? So they're just blocks, for example, but they also have some semantic content. So let's look at that representation. This one is going to be something like this. It's something really similar to what we've just seen. The difference is going to be that, for example, header is going to be in a header tag. It's a bit different. Nav is going to represent my menu. I have a main part which contains an article with some sections. Right, so let's see how this looks. Well, it would look really similar to the div representation because header, main, article, etc. Uh, don't actually have presentation information. However, what we've done is, for contrast, we've used some headings and some paragraphs. So it's not just going to look like it's right. So you can see that these, so header, for example, is actually a display block. So it's basically a semantic div. It's a div with a pre-established significance. Obviously, this one, which is a heading, actually has all those styles. Okay, so that would be the thing about structure. So obviously, when given a choice, we're going to prefer these semantic elements. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is forms, right? Because, like I said, we have some output things and some input things, and the input elements are going to be the forms. Now, if I think about input controls, so input components, I can think of a few fundamental ones, right? It's, when I describe input components, they're made up of these fundamental ones. So I can think about an input text, or I can think about a checkbox, or I can think about a radio button, or a combo box, or a select, etc. So these, from the beginning of HTML, I have these, right? I've always had these. Um, but the target is to maintain this set relatively low. So, because you want a homogeneous implementation on all platforms, on all browsers, what you actually want to have is you want to limit yourself to things like inputs, input texts, and combo boxes, and drop boxes, and so forth. Drop downs, sorry, or and so forth. But not implement things like data tables, right? That's left to the programmer. But first of all, let's look at forms from a more, let's say, from higher up, and see how they work and how they were supposed to work initially. So, assuming we have a file which contains a form, I see that Visual Studio Code actually pre-populated an attribute called action. Well, this relates to the way that forms were supposed to work initially, right? So, the idea of a web application is of about the same age as HTML itself. But obviously, the way we think about web applications evolved in time, because now we have stuff like Google Drive, and initially this was not even a target. That's because the way that the traditional web applications were thought to work, right? It's the plan for them was this: you request an HTML page from the server. The page comes and it contains a form. Now, what you do is you fill in the stuff in the form and you click a special button, which is a submit button. Now, what the submit does, it packages everything that existed in the form, everything that you've input, and it sends it via an HTTP method to an action on the server. And that action executes some code in some fashion and gives you back another HTML file. Now, this new HTML file might also contain the form. And again, you fill the form, and again, you invoke an action. So let's sort of see this in action, but in a simplified way. So let's say we had a test.cgi, which is anyway how it was called, method. Let's say it's get, and we have an input text, right, which is an input type text. Now the name is going to be useful. The ID is not going to be useful in this instance, but the name we need. So we're going to say prop, let's say first, and we have an input submit. Go. So by default, what submit is going to do is going to package whatever I've written in this form and send it. So let's look at this. Let's close a bunch of these. And the way it's going to send it, and if you remember, we've talked about this when talking about URLs. It's actually going to send it URL encoded. So if I do A, it's going to try to go to test CGI. Obviously, it doesn't exist. First equals A. Let's go back. But if I do first, second, now this value isn't valid in a URL, right? So it had to URL encode it. Now, what if I change the method? Let's go here, and we're gonna say method post. But if I change the method and I click this, let me just. Obviously, I still get an error, but I notice that I no longer have the parameters in the URL. What I actually do have, if I go to network, so I have a failed thing, and here I can see how they were sent. They were sent in the request body, but but they were also URL encoded. Right, so this is how forms work. Now if I omit the method and the action, let's just go to a new file. What the browser is going to assume is that I'm requesting myself on get. And we can see this pretty clearly. One sec. Alright, so I'm requesting myself with the method get. Now, what else do I have at my disposal? Let's see. Well, I have some, let's call them traditional, these fundamental control elements, right? So these fundamental inputs, such as radio. One sec, sorry. Such as radio buttons and checkboxes. But I also have some modern elements. Now, these modern elements have another interesting engineering choice in the sense that uh, it it was assumed from the very beginning that they might not be implemented. So they have fallbacks, right? So I can have a complex calendar control, and if that doesn't exist, it's just going to be a an input text, sorry. So it's going to be default to an input text so that I can still use the page. So let's see this. If I go and make a 14.html, and I'm just going to copy paste something with the basic controls. Nope. Right. So this is choice, let's say. Right, so first things first. I can see that I have an input type text, which is a text input. And it has a name and an ID. Now, name is relevant for what happens on the server. Because, like I saw, whenever I package whatever is in this form, I'm going to basically construct a list of key value pairs. And the key is going to be whatever was in the name attribute. Now ID is relevant on the client side, and it's going to help me to select via a unique ID this particular tag, and thus access the DOM object behind it. In this case, we're also using ID to associate a label to this particular input. So I have input type text, then I have input type radio. Now what radio buttons do is that if they have the same name, I'm only going to be able to select one of the values. Then I have checkboxes. Now checkboxes are a bit different because I can select multiple values. This also means that whoever receives these values has to be prepared to encounter a repeated key, right? So the same key two times. Now for the checkboxes, I noticed something else, which is this checked bit. Now this checked attribute is actually something specific, which is if I think about an attribute which might contain true or false, I no longer have to write, I can, but I no longer have to write the value. Because the simple fact that the attribute exists can represent that it's true, and if it doesn't exist, then it's false. Now, the last thing showing here is a select, which is going to give us a drop down. And of course, I have the submit button, which is just going to package everything up and send it to the server. So let's look at that. Right, so we have some text, yes or no, cats and or dogs. So let's say cats and dogs, and a single value. Although selects can be used with multiple values. And I can see what was sent to the server. Now additionally, I have an input type button, which is a button without the default behavior of submit, which is sending stuff to the server. I have an input type reset, which is going to reset all fields in the form, and I have an input type hidden. Now this is something which I might want to send to the server, but which wasn't input by the user directly, rather calculated in my JavaScript code. I'm going to pause. Right, so relating to your question, so the idea is that the IDs just identify tags. Now, how does this work? So first off, I told you that we have some global attributes. Sorry, this is the Romanian one, but we'll make do with it. Uh, in fact, I think we can do this. Maybe, maybe. Right, so the idea is this. If I think about tags, like I said, for simple practicality, I'm going to have to be able to customize the tags. Now, this means I'm going to have some attributes available. Some of these attributes are going to be relevant for any tag, so global attributes. Some of them are not, right? So for example, value doesn't make sense unless I'm an input, right, of sorts, some sort of an input of some sort. A div.value doesn't make sense. Uh, so some of these attributes are global. Where are they? Global. And the first thing I might run into is ID. And ID uniquely identifies the tag. So it's just a unique identifier which I can use for whatever I want to. Now I can use this to use CSS selectors, like you said. I can also use this to get the corresponding object from JavaScript. Because the idea of an ID is that it just uniquely identifies the tag. Um, Now, if we're at global attributes, and please ask me again if it's unclear. If you're at global attributes, we also have a bunch more global attributes. Some of them are, let's call them more general, some of them less general. It's so more generally useful. So class specifies a number of classes associated with the tag. Now this allows me to do class composition. So if I have a button and it's supposed to be a positive button, whatever that means, probably green, and it's supposed to be a large button, I could just put two classes there, one representing the idea of a positive button and one representing the idea of a large button. Now, obviously, we're going to go back to all this stuff when we talk about CSS, and obviously we've seen earlier that there was a time when classes were also used for semantics. Now style, again, is something general, and it allows me to modify style properties without external classes, directly on the tag. And we're going to see what the use for this is when we talk about CSS. Now I have a bunch of things which are a bit less used, such as title, which is a tooltip, and this is there for accessibility purposes, right? Because I can replace any tag, whatever it represents, with a string representation. Right? And maybe the device couldn't read the thing, but it can read the string representation. Then I have language, right? Like I said, it's useful when I have multi-language documents. I have access key, which is a shortcut, right? Something I can press to get to that tab. Uh, then I have tab index. If I navigate by pressing tab, because in any interface, if I keep pressing tab, it's going to go through all selectable elements. And in this case, I can tell it the order in which to do this. Direction, which is for text, and so which is the direction of the text. If I have text which is in a language which uses another direction compared to, say, English or in any European language, really. And then I have a bunch of new attributes which are from HTML5, and I'm going to note two of them. Well, sort of two of them. One of them is content editable. And this allows me to turn any tag into basically an input because I can have a div which is content editable, and this means I'm going to be able to write HTML within it. The second thing I want to note is the data minus thing. The data minus thing is a prefix. So in various technologies, I might need to define my own custom attributes, and I can do that, of course. However, what might happen is that the standard itself is going to evolve, and at some point it's going to use something which I've used as an attribute. right? So if I have special, the standard might at some point have the special attribute. So to avoid this, what I can do is if I do need custom attributes, I'm going to prefix them with data minus, and this is going to make it so that it's never going to be overwritten by something in the standard. Okay, now something else. So I have these things, but I also have a bunch of other input controls which are have been introduced in HTML5. Now a couple of things to note. I'm going to show you some of them. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but that's not all of them. The second thing to note is some of them are not going to work. That's because, and this is actually a strength of HTML, which is that although they're not supported, the logic is still going to work. One sec, let me just find them. Right, so prepare for a wall of text. So what do I have here? So some of them are more specific, such as a data list, right, which is going to allow me to select from a list of things. And this is the idea of searching within a list. Then I'm going to have an input for an email or for a telephone, etc. Now the reason for these is that they're supposed to have some trivial validators. Now, as an aside, any kind of validation I do on the client is a matter of ease of use, right? It's not a matter of security, it's not a matter of data integrity, because the web is constructed in such a fashion that whatever validations you put on the client, they can be circumvented. And you're going to see this in your tutorials where you're going to do some request crafting. So you can send whatever request you want to, valid or invalid, it doesn't matter. So any kind of validation that I have to do for security or data integrity, I have to do on the server. The reason why I might have validations on the client is to just give the answer to the client faster without a round trip to the server. However, at least on my browser, on my Linux, these don't work. Now, like I said, this is actually an argument for HTML in the sense that even though they don't work, they're replaced with something simpler. Right, so this is a select list. These, I can see I can write anything in them. That's because they behave as text inputs. That's fine. If they didn't behave as text inputs, I would have had a little message here which would have told me that this is not really an email. Let's see something that does work. So this works. See, I can delete the value. This doesn't work, but this works. This is also a text input which has been disguised to be something more than that. This works. These look pretty cool. Right, so if you have them, that's fine. If you don't, they're text inputs. This is a spinner basically for a number, this is an interval, and this is also an input for a color. And the value of a color, we'll see next time with CSS, but the value of a color is something which is numeric, right? It's either represented as a string or numeric. It's a string representing a numeric value, so it's something like this. So if I want to write something like say white, it would be this, which is the value for red, the first two, green, and blue. Which means I can actually input this from a text input, and color also would behave as a text input if I didn't have an actual implementation in the browser. Does this make sense? Um, okay, so I'm going to pause for a bit again. Right, so these are the basics of HTML. If you run into if we run into anything more bizarre, we'll explain it at that particular time. Now, we also want to look at something else, which is events in the browser. We're not going to have time to finish this discussion, but at least we want to start it, so we keep everything nice and correlated. So if I inspect something, let's go to a I don't know. Let's take something. Doesn't really matter. Right. So if I inspect something like this link, I'm going to notice that yes, I do see the tree-like structure here, but I can also do something else, which is I can go to properties. And when I do go to properties, like I said, so this tree structure actually is also a, let's call it a projection of the real representation which exists in the browser. That is, when it parsed this file, the browser built something which is called the document object model, which is a tree of objects. Now, if I look at this particular node in my tree of objects, I can notice something, right? So A is an HTML anchor element, which is an HTML element, which is an element, which is a node, which is an event target, which is an object. So this looks very much like inheritance because it is. So we start from the base is the most abstract thing, right? The most generic thing, which is object. And object has these things, right? It just has constructor, has own property, etc. But if I look at HTML anchor element, it has a bunch more things, right? A itself has nothing in it. And if I look at HTML element, well, I now notice properties corresponding to my global attributes, among other things, right? So I have access key, like I said, and I have direction, and so forth. But I can also notice some more properties which look a bit stranger, which are on something, right? Now what these are is their event properties. That means that I can actually put JavaScript code within them, and they're going to be run when that event happens. So let's look at the basics of this, and then we're going to wrap it up. So let's assume we have this HTML file. It has a head and a body. So let's say we have an input type button. Value is what's written on him, so click me. And then on click, and notice that it's a bit archaic because it's written in something other than camel case. And the way JavaScript worked initially is I can just say console log hello. I'm sorry, one sec. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Imediat cobor acum. So, like I was saying, I can actually execute the JavaScript code here. Okay, but I have to wonder. So I'm gonna say hello. Okay, so I have to wonder what's actually happening, right? So if I do this, because I'm passing a string there, so let's just test this out. It's 16, and if I click this, I'm going to see hello in the console. Well, what's happening is a bit strange because what's happening is I gave it a string here, and it's been evaluated, wrapped in an anonymous function, and put in on click. It sounds like a headache. Right, so this is how it worked initially. Let's make this a bit more elegant. And with this occasion, let's see, you know, how things tie together. I'm going to take this and just rewrite it. So presumably, I'm going to have a script tag, right? And within this tag, I'm going to have a function which says hello. So I'm going to say const click handler, or let's call it handle click, is a function probably of event, right? That's how it looks, even though we're not going to use event, which does this. Now we might put the function instead of console log, but this isn't much of a solution. So what we actually want to do is we're going to get our button and add the click handler to it. Now how would we get our button? This leads us to what we were talking about earlier with the ID. So let's say the button has the ID b1. Now, you might get the button in a couple of ways. Let's just look in the console. We're going to see that, like I said, we have a bunch of global objects. Right? So one of these global objects is document. Another one is window. Actually, document is window.document. But document has getElement by ID, which allows us to get something via its ID. GetElement by class name, elements by class name, by tag name, etc. So this gives me some amount of flexibility. Now, getElement by ID is the fastest way to get something in a web page. However, this doesn't gives me, so it handles all the easy cases, but not the complicated cases. So let's say we want to get all the buttons within all the table rows, which are odd rows, within a div, which has the class special. It's going to be a nightmare just with these methods. So what we'd actually need here is some way of defining and using a search expression within a tree, which is going to express what I've just said, right? So all the buttons within the odd rows, etc. So if we want to do that, we can use a couple of other methods, query selector and query selector all. Now the difference between them is that query selector, given a search expression, is going to give me the first thing matching that expression, while query selector all is going to give me all the things matching that expression. As for the expression itself, we're going to see next time that what it actually is a CSS selector. Now CSS selectors are always present within the browser. So if I look at my elements, I can see at styles that this is a selector. What selectors actually are is search expressions within a tree. Like I said, we'll get back to this later. For now, let's just look at our event. So what we want to do is have the button getAround by ID b1, right? And we're gonna say b1 dot on click because that's how we put it. Is handle click. And if we try to run this, it's not going to work. Now let's see that it doesn't work and why it doesn't work. It's 17. So we cannot set properties of null. What happened here is, if I think about it, the browser interprets things in the order it runs into them, right? So it ran into this script and it tried to do something with button, and it said document getElement by ID b1, but this came later, which means it didn't exist yet, which means it's b1 is null, which means b1.onClick is an error. Now what might we do? Well, we can do the naive solution, which is just change the order. Now it's going to work. Now I don't personally favor this kind of approach, but we're going to run into it if you inspect stuff on the internet. Now what else might we do? Well, we might wonder, when can we run some code which is dependent on things being loaded? Now I apologize, I'm going to take a couple of more minutes of your time. Well, like I said, we consider this not necessarily a good approach. We're going to move it back and we're going to say, okay, so when can I know that the button exists? Well, I can know that the button exists whenever the page is loaded. And I can know the page is loaded because some sort of event was fired. And the event we can use for this is window.onload. So this code can only be validly run whenever everything was loaded. So we're going to say window.onload. And then if we put this in window.onload, it's going to work. Additionally, we have one more issue. One sec. One more issue, which is one sec. Which is the fact that we may or may not want to either add an additional handler to another click handler to input, or maybe better handle handle the removal of a button better, the removal of a handler better. So instead of doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to say b1 dot add event listener on click is handle click, and now we can actually click this and it's going to work. We're actually going to stop here, and we'll continue next time with the next of the event examples and discussion.